Hi there, I'm Adam Nayman with another Ringer video essay. A biopic about the life and times of Ronald Reagan starring Dennis Quaid is set to be released. It's an event that gives Reagan a cinematic portrait to go not only with his multiple films that he appeared in as a movie star, but also the biopics of real-life presidents that have been made about everybody from Abraham Lincoln to George W. Bush to Barack Obama. In theory, this fall also brings The Apprentice, a scathing portrait of former President Donald Trump's early years in thrall to the diabolical power broker Roy Cohn. In this context, on the threshold of what is looking like one of the most polarizing and anxious White House races of all time, it seems like an interesting moment to look at some movies about the presidency. Not movies about real presidents, but about fictional ones. Movies whose narratives channel authentic attitudes about the moments of their production. These are not necessarily the 10 best movies about presidential characters, but ones that I think are particularly evocative and provocative about the role of the commander-in-chief. In some of these films we see presidents as heroes, in others villains, and most interestingly of all, somewhere in between. And there's very fascinating resonances, I think, between these movies, not just suggesting influence from movie to movie, but kind of perennial, eternal questions about representation, about politics, and about power that always surface when movies on this topic are made. The title of Gregory Le Cava's 1933 comedy Game Over the White House evokes the Old Testament. The question at the heart of the film is this: what if divine intervention were not only real, but was living in Washington, D.C.? The great character actor Walter Houston plays the U.S. President Judson Hammond, a corrupt, philandering guy who crashes his car, falls into a coma, and emerges a bit mysteriously and a little bit unsettlingly as a Lincoln-esque statesman. This new version of the president has some very strong ideas about his job. He rules with an iron fist in a velvet glove. Game Over the White House is essentially a portrait of benevolent dictatorship, predicated on an extremely selective idea of democracy. The plot involves the president declaring war on crime, which doesn't just mean bringing people to justice, but preparing to actually just execute racketeers, ostensibly for the greater good. These plot points and the movie's tone as a whole are absolutely byproducts of the Great Depression, and yet the movie also feels like a timeless parable about power, albeit one that comes down on the side of American exceptionalism. Judson's final act is to gather together a group of world leaders and show them, subtly but forcefully, that they need to fall in line behind the United States military strength, or else. This is supposed to be a happy ending. One of the most ideologically fraught movies ever made about the presidency, Game Over the White House has some strange echoes down through the decades, while also standing apart from the other movies on this list on its own strange and isolationist territory. It certainly says something about Stanley Kubrick's respect for Peter Sellers that he allowed the legendary British comedian to improvise during their collaborations. It couldn't have been easy for a control freak like Kubrick to let his leading man riff all over the screen. In Lolita, Sellers played a sinister master of disguise, effortlessly adopting multiple personas. For his follow-up project with Kubrick, he doubled and tripled down on the human chameleon act, embodying 3 separate characters: one British, one German, and one American, all with a front row seat at the end of the world as we know it. Dr. Strangelove is named for a diabolical wheelchair-bound Nazi scientist modeled on the German defector Werner von Braun, but its funniest and most politically resonant character is President Merkin Muffley, played by Sellers as a bald Adlai Stevenson clone whose name suggests a failure to communicate. Despite the series of Strangelove's literary source material, an alarmist anti-nuke thriller called Red Alert, Muffley's inability to manage the unfolding international incident at the story's center is played for laughs. Narrowing his eyes, lowering his voice, and eliminating any traits of heroism, Sellers essays a species of bureaucratic paralysis that's instantly recognizable to anyone who's ever agonized over a sign-off from an over-their-head boss. The film was released shortly after the assassination of JFK and ruthlessly exploited America's fears of a leadership vacuum. At its core, Dr. Strangelove is a cautionary tale about the idea that the powers that be are not only incompetent but also immoral. The flip side of Gabriel over the White House, including an ending that inverts that film's message that a nation's weapons of mass destruction will deliver the world from larger evil. Here, America's doomsday device goes off, as expected, and that's all, folks. Failsafe has basically the same plot as Dr. Strangelove, a squadron of American bombers poised to obliterate Moscow due to a combination of human and machine error. It also came out in the exact same year of 1964, but the movie has a completely different tone. Like so many films by the director Sidney Lumet, Failsafe is styled as a sweat-drenched melodrama in which angry men vent their spleens while the fates of innocence hang in the balance. For all its apocalyptic bleakness, however, Failsafe is also to some extent an uplifting study in moral rectitude, embodied by Henry Fonda's nameless and distinctly Kennedy-esque president, who does a much better job of manning the hotline to the Kremlin than Merck and Muffley, even if the end results aren't ultimately much better. The casting is especially clever as several decades earlier, Fonda had played no less than Honest Abe in John Ford's stirring and patriotic biopic Young Mr. Lincoln. He channels a similar gravitas in Failsafe, even if there's no chance of emancipation from this particular predicament. In Failsafe's shocking climax, Fonda's president makes the unthinkable decision to obliterate one of his country's biggest cities as a gesture of repentance and humility towards the Soviets, a finale that is in line with the violent divisions of the decade around it, even as, in the spirit of humane optimism, it tries to defy it. The Big Apple is destroyed at the end of Failsafe, but Escape from New York imagines a fate worse than death for the city that never sleeps. Here, it's been transformed into a kind of free-range maximum security prison yard, overrun by inmates in a sick parody of urban decay and decadence. Imagine Mad Max set in Times Square, and you get the basic idea. The premise of John Carpenter's superlatively sleazy B-movie is that a helicopter transporting the president over NYC has been hijacked and waylaid within the city limits, and only the ornery mercenary Snake Plissken can get him out. Or he can at least die trying. In retrospect, certain aspects of Carpenter's film are weirdly and unsettlingly resonant, from the idea of a president building a wall to contain bad hombres, to the imagery of low-flying aircraft amidst a cluster of skyscrapers. But the best thing about Escape from New York is its basic unpretentiousness. It's a lean, nasty little crowd pleaser, occupying rhetorical territory far removed from Strangelove's Juvenalian satire or Failsafe's doomsday prophecy. With this in mind, its presidential figure is also a thin, one-dimensional character, a hapless, bedraggled suit, played by Donald Pleasance with a distinct lack of gravitas and absolutely zero charm. To the extent that Carpenter has an ethos, it's anti-authoritarian, and he clearly enjoys seeing the leader of the free world taken down a peg or two or three. Pleasance, and there's no nice way to say this, looks like shit for the entire movie, and gets mocked mercilessly by Kurt Russell's charismatic antihero, who has no respect for him even as he's saving his life. By the end, it's clear that this president is barely worth the effort, and he gets his comeuppance in an ending that goofs on the Lincolnish idea of an uplifting 11th hour oratory, while also nodding to the paranoid surveillance of the Nixon administration. Political commentary sealed by Carpenter with a smirk. Some movies are intended as serious allegories, some fall into that a bit accidentally. It's hard to say whether the White House farce Dave, directed by Ivan Reitman, was intentionally developed as a commentary on the transition from the uptight blandness of George H.W. Bush to the populism of Bill Clinton, but that's exactly how the movie plays. While the plot gimmick of switched-out doppelgangers reaches back to Frank Capra, and even further to Mark Twain, Kevin Kline's dual performances as an unpopular and ailing U.S. president and the heartland nobody thrust into the spotlight as part of cover-up captured something authentic about the healing vibes of the early 90s, when Bill Clinton assured a nation that he felt its pain. The film is also, however incidentally, a bit of a spiritual remake of Gerbo Over the White House, except here, instead of an incapacitated president waking up a changed man, he just gets replaced by a superior model. There are a lot of funny gags in Dave, including a killer cameo by Oliver Stone that mocks its early 90s status as Hollywood's conspiracy theorist du jour. But the film is also a bit flat and pandering. A more subversive comedy, a more Kubrickian comedy, might have had something to say about absolute power corrupting absolutely, or it would have shown us something of Dave's dark side. But, as skillfully played by Kline, the movie's namesake is flawless, wonderful, and very much the hero his country deserves. A figure of honor and decency a la Jimmy Carter, whose happy ending, however far it actually leaves him from Pennsylvania Avenue, is never in doubt. Imagine Escape from New York if Pliskin or maybe Indiana Jones had been the president, and that's the gist of Air Force One, which casts Harrison Ford as a two-fisted, machine gun-toting head of state, surrounds him with some state-of-the-art mid-90s action filmmaking courtesy of Wolfgang Petersen, and, heads on to gross hundreds of millions of dollars. In its summer blockbuster fashion, Wolfgang Petersen's movie says something pretty profound about its era. If Aaron Sorkin's contemporaneous romantic comedy, The American President, evoked Bill Clinton's horn dog image through the presence of Michael Douglas, Air Force One touched on the bipartisan desire for a president defined by a certain softness to toughen up. As a movie, Air Force One is not much more than a well-oiled cliché machine, but is a fugue of wish fulfillment in which the most powerful man in the world is also enough of a badass to take down Russian hijackers, all while protecting his wife and daughter. It's practically perfect in every way. Four years after he tried to save the president's life in the Line of Fire, a movie like Air Force One, directed by Wolfgang Petersen, Clint Eastwood, famously the mayor of Carmel, California in real life, and as such, the highest-ranking actor-turned-American politician since Ronald Reagan, squared off against an evil commander-in-chief in absolute power. The film, which he also directed, is an airport paperback thriller par excellence, and it manifests as a conservative flip side to the liberal warship of the mid-90s. Here, Gene Hackman's venal, self-serving president Alan Richman presides over a lethal cover-up after getting violent with a one-night stand. The subtext of behind-the-scenes government malfeasance dates back to Watergate, but the performance by Judy Davis as Richmond's vicious chief of staff reminded a lot of critics of Hillary Clinton, a carefully aimed cheap shot that gives the film's plotting a little bit of real-world tension. The suggestion is that Davis's character is effectively a puppet master, and it bounces off all kinds of conspiracy theories about what the Clintons were doing with their power behind closed doors. The real joke in the film, though, pertains to the Eastwood character's status as a master of disguise, as if Clint Eastwood could ever be anybody but himself. About a decade later, in the early 2000s, Eastwood would reinvent himself artistically as an Oscar madman. But for real Clintonians, the trashy, twisty likes of absolute power are a big part of his contribution to American pop culture. For most of the 2000s, at least cinematically speaking, George W. Bush played himself. From Fahrenheit 9/11 to Death of a President to Step Brothers, agitation-minded directors were willing and happy to directly attack and depict the architect of the Iraq War rather than craft some kind of veiled fictional surrogate figure. Ditto Oliver Stone, who cast Josh Brolin as the man himself in a rushed biopic. The common thesis of these and other seditious satires was that W was kind of dim, and yet the decade's-defining treatise As Stupid Is, As Stupid Does went in a pretty different direction when it came to its presidential character. Enter a bulked-up, hulked-out, star-spangled Terry Crews as one Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho, the man in charge in the 25th century in Mike Judge's Idiocracy, a man whose decision to water the nation's crops with energy drinks, quote-unquote, it's got what plants crave, has America on the verge of starvation and final ruin. Idiocracy is cheaply made. It was doomed to fail commercially, and its dysgenics-driven plot, which calls back to the themes and setting of Brave New World quite intentionally, came in for charges of political incorrectness. All of this is fair enough, and yet it's hard to shake Idiocracy's vision of a country chipping cheerfully away at its collective IQ, or of a president whose rhetoric about the best way to make America great, again, or in the future, is indistinguishable from the rhetoric of a 1980s pro wrestler. Of course James Woods plays the bad guy in White House Down. It's a movie about a right-wing plot to take down a liberal president, modeled, however abstractly, on Barack Obama. Effectively Air Force One for the new millennium, and directed by the poor man's Wolfgang Petersen and Roland Emmerich, White House Down conjures up a heroic interracial tag team of Jamie Foxx and Channing Tatum. The latter is a special agent, John Cale, who bizarrely shares his name with a founding member of the Velvet Underground. It pits them against paramilitary insurrectionists who are there to be mowed down like video game villains. Despite a subplot about the human collateral that comes with being in charge of Team America, Fox's James Sawyer is an upstanding, unblemished hero who just wants to hug his daughter and wear his Air Jordans in peace. The film's simplistic and satisfying moral calculus basically says that a man of words must become a man of action, just like in Air Force One. It's the sort of movie that falls apart if you think about it for too long, but then of course, you're not really supposed to think about it at all. Adam McKay knows his movie history, and Don't Look Up is a film deeply imbued with the spirit of Dr. Strangelove. In fact, it could have been subtitled How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Climate Change. Environmental concerns of all kinds get allegorized in the film in the form of an incoming meteor, with Leonardo DiCaprio cast as an anxious Chicken Little, whose warnings of apocalypse fall on deaf ears, including those of the president, Janie Orlean, played by Meryl Streep as an unlikely and unholy mashup of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. It's a signal that McKay and his co-writer David Siraka are trying to reach across the aisle in the spirit of bipartisan satire. Streep's greatest living actress shtick can often get wearying depending on the project, but she's nothing if not game, and she does her best to disappear into McKay's trademark cartoon chaos. Orlean is at once sly and oblivious, motivated by craven self-interest, even as she attempts to act on behalf of the quote-unquote greater good. She does get her comeuppance, although not before helping to ensure the deaths of billions and billions of innocents. Instead of copping out, Don't Look Now stays Kubrickian to the bitter end. It's not subtle, we might say, but then neither is reality. We hope that you've enjoyed this essay about fictional movie presidents. Inevitably, we forgot a few. Perhaps we forgot your favorite. You can let us know in the comments what we did wrong, what we did right, if you want us to keep doing them, if you'd be happy if we never did them again, whatever works for you. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.